Imagine this. You're living on the outskirts of a sleepy town surrounded by acres of land. It's not your typical suburban setting. It's more secluded, with the nearest neighbor a good distance away. Sounds like the perfect place for peace and quiet, right? Well, not quite. One fateful weekend, while going about your usual routine, you catch sight of a figure wandering through the trees on your property. Strange, considering the direction they're headed leads to nothing but dense woods. You brush it off at first, but as night falls, those footsteps outside your window send shivers down your spine. Turns out, this mysterious visitor has a knack for showing up uninvited. Each time, inching closer to your doorstep, until one eerie night, you find him standing in your driveway, staring up at your house with an unsettling gaze. Cue the goosebumps. With the police on their way, you brace yourself for the worst. But when they finally arrive, the man disappears into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread. Was he just a lost soul wandering the night, or something far more sinister? The answers remain buried in the shadows. Now, on to our next tale of terror. Picture this: a small warehouse, tucked away from prying eyes, its secrets hidden behind nondescript walls. It's the perfect setting for a late-night encounter you'd rather forget. As the lone worker on the graveyard shift, you're no stranger to solitude. But when a persistent stranger begins knocking on the doors after hours, you can't help but feel a chill in the air. Despite your warnings, he keeps coming back, night after night, like a specter haunting the premises. Then, one evening, while on the job, you hear a strange noise emanating from the back of the building. Curiosity gets the better of you, leading to a discovery that sends shivers down your spine. That same stranger lurking in the shadows, his intentions unknown, his presence unsettling. With the authorities alerted, you hope for an end to the madness. But as days pass and the stranger eludes capture, you can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. His motives as murky as the night itself. And finally, we have a tale that hits a little too close to home. Imagine returning to your condo after a long day's work, only to find yourself face to face with an intruder. Despite your best efforts to secure your home, this unwelcome guest slips inside unnoticed, leaving you paralyzed with fear. As you grapple with the aftermath of the break-in, questions linger. How did they gain entry? What were they after? And perhaps most chilling of all, will they strike again? In the end, the answers remain elusive, lost to the shadows of uncertainty. But one thing's for sure: when it comes to tales of terror, the truth is often stranger than fiction. Now, let's delve deeper into the dark and twisted history of our local cemetery, where stories of murder and mystery abound. The cemetery sits on the edge of town, shrouded in fog and legend. By day, it's a peaceful resting place for the departed, but by night, it transforms into a haunting ground for unsolved mysteries and restless spirits. The first story takes us back to the early 1900s when the town was just starting to grow. A young woman named Eliza lived a quiet life, helping her family on their farm. One evening, she went to the cemetery to visit her mother's grave, as she often did. She never returned home. Her body was found the next morning, lifeless and cold, with no visible injuries. The town was in shock, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was the work of a vengeful spirit, others whispered of a dark ritual gone wrong. To this day, no one knows what truly happened to Eliza, but her ghost is said to wander the cemetery, searching for answers. Next, we have the tale of the gravedigger, Thomas, who worked in the cemetery for over 30 years. Thomas was a man of few words, dedicated to his work, and always seen with a shovel in hand. But beneath his quiet exterior lay a dark secret. One night, a series of gruesome murders rocked the town, with the victims found buried in the cemetery, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Thomas was arrested, but he never confessed to the crimes. He died in prison, and the murders stopped, but the mystery remains unsolved. Some say his spirit still haunts the cemetery, guarding the secrets he took to his grave. Our final story is perhaps the most chilling of all. In the 1980s, a group of teenagers decided to spend the night in the cemetery as a dare. They brought tents, flashlights, and plenty of bravado, ready for a night of spooky fun. But what they encountered was far beyond their worst nightmares. As the night wore on, strange noises surrounded them, whispers carried on the wind, and shadows danced among the graves. One by one, they disappeared, leaving no trace behind. The search parties found nothing, and the case was eventually closed. But the legend of the missing teens lives on, a cautionary tale for those who dare to disturb the resting place of the dead. Ravenwood Cemetery lay on the outskirts of town, an ancient resting place shrouded in myths and mysteries. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the air was perpetually thick with fog and the whispers of the past. Generations of townsfolk had been laid to rest there, their graves marked by weathered tombstones and crumbling mausoleums. For years, rumors had circulated about the cemetery being haunted. The locals spoke of a phantom, a ghostly figure that roamed the grounds at night seeking vengeance. This tale was mostly told to scare children, but deep down, everyone harbored a flicker of belief. The phantom was said to be the spirit of a man named Victor Hawthorne, who had met a gruesome end in the cemetery many decades ago. Victor had been the caretaker of Ravenwood, a man of solitary habits and few words. He lived in a small cottage at the edge of the cemetery and was devoted to his duties, ensuring that the graves were well tended and the grounds were kept immaculate. Despite his diligence, Victor was not well liked. He was often accused of strange behavior, and whispers of dark rituals began to taint his name. One stormy night, Victor vanished without a trace. The townspeople found his cottage abandoned, his possessions left untouched. Days later, his mutilated body was discovered in a freshly dug grave, his face frozen in an expression of terror. The murder was never solved, and the case was soon closed, leaving a dark stain on the history of Ravenwood. In the years following Victor's death, strange occurrences began to plague the cemetery. Graves were found disturbed, eerie lights were seen floating among the tombstones, and chilling screams echoed through the night. The townspeople started to believe that Victor's restless spirit was haunting the grounds, seeking revenge on those who had wronged him. The legend of the Phantom of Ravenwood grew, and few dared to enter the cemetery after dark. But one person was determined to uncover the truth. Emily Saunders, a young journalist with a knack for investigating the supernatural, arrived in town with a mission: to prove the existence of the Phantom and solve the mystery of Victor Hawthorne's murder. Emily spent weeks researching the history of Ravenwood and interviewing the townspeople. She uncovered old newspaper articles and police reports, piecing together the events leading up to Victor's death. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that something sinister was at play. One foggy night, Emily decided to spend the night in the cemetery, hoping to encounter the Phantom herself. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, she made her way through the iron gates and into the heart of Ravenwood. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As the hours passed, Emily wandered among the tombstones, her flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. She felt a growing sense of unease, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. Suddenly, she heard a faint whisper, a voice carried on the wind. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper led her to an old mausoleum, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The door was slightly ajar, and Emily felt a cold draft emanating from within. Summoning her courage, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty and cold, and her flashlight revealed a staircase leading down into darkness. Emily descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the bottom, she found herself in a dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with ancient coffins. In the center of the room stood a single open grave, its edges freshly dug. As she approached, she saw something glinting in the dirt. She bent down and picked up a small, tarnished locket. Opening it, she found a faded photograph of a young woman. She recognized the face from her research. It was Victor's fiancée, who had died under mysterious circumstances years before his own death. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and Emily felt a presence behind her. She turned to see a ghostly figure materialize before her, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. It was Victor, his face twisted in anguish. He pointed to the locket, then to the open grave. Emily realized that the locket was the key to solving the mystery, a connection between Victor's death and that of his fiancée. As she stood frozen in fear, the phantom began to speak, his voice a haunting whisper. He revealed the truth. He had been murdered by the townspeople who had discovered his secret. He had been practicing forbidden rituals in an attempt to bring his fiancée back from the dead. When they found out, they had killed him and buried the evidence. Victor's spirit had been trapped in the cemetery, unable to find peace until the truth was revealed. Emily promised to expose the townspeople's crimes and bring justice to Victor and his fiancée. The phantom nodded, a look of relief washing over his spectral face, and slowly faded away. Emily emerged from the mausoleum as dawn broke, her mind racing with the revelations of the night. She knew that her life would never be the same, but she was determined to honor her promise. She wrote a series of articles detailing the dark history of Ravenwood and the injustice done to Victor Hawthorne. The townspeople were shocked by the revelations, and a sense of unease settled over the town. The cemetery was no longer just a place of rest for the dead. It was a reminder of the dark secrets that lay buried beneath its soil. Victor's grave was given a proper headstone, and his story was finally told. And so, the legend of the Phantom of Ravenwood came to an end, but the cemetery remained a place of mystery and fear. To this day, visitors to Ravenwood claim to feel a chill in the air and hear whispers on the wind. Some say it's just their imagination, but others believe that Victor's spirit still watches over the cemetery, ensuring that the truth is never forgotten. Blackwood Cemetery sat on a lonely hill, its wrought iron gates perpetually open as if to invite the brave, or the foolish, inside. The cemetery was ancient, its origins lost to time, but it was infamous for the series of gruesome murders that had occurred within its bounds over the past century. Locals whispered of a curse, claiming that anyone who set foot in Blackwood after sunset was doomed to a violent end. The most recent victim was Samuel Gray, a local historian who had been investigating the cemetery's dark past. Samuel had always been fascinated by the macabre, and Blackwood's history intrigued him. Determined to uncover the truth behind the murders, he spent countless hours poring over old records and talking to the few elderly townspeople who still remembered the cemetery's bloody legacy. One stormy evening, Samuel decided to explore Blackwood himself. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, he passed through the creaking gates and ventured into the heart of the cemetery. The wind howled through the trees and the rain fell in heavy sheets, but Samuel was undeterred. He was determined to find evidence of the curse, or to debunk it once and for all. As he walked among the graves, his flashlight revealed tombstones worn by time and weather. Names and dates were barely legible, but Samuel felt a strange connection to the people buried there. He wondered how many of them had met violent ends, their deaths attributed to the curse. Samuel's investigation led him to a large, imposing mausoleum at the cemetery's center. The structure was made of dark stone, its entrance flanked by twisted, gargoyle-like statues. Despite the rain, the door was slightly ajar. Samuel hesitated for a moment, a shiver of apprehension running down his spine. But curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Samuel's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mausoleum was filled with crypts, each one sealed with a heavy stone slab. But one crypt stood open, its cover lying broken on the floor. As Samuel approached the open crypt, he felt a strange, oppressive presence. His heart pounded in his chest and his hands trembled as he directed the flashlight into the dark recess. Inside, he saw the skeletal remains of a man, his bones twisted and broken. Clutched in the bony fingers was a small, leather-bound book. Samuel reached into the crypt and carefully pried the book from the skeleton's grasp. The cover was worn and the pages were brittle with age, but the writing was still legible. It was a journal, written by a man named Edgar Blackwood, the cemetery's namesake. Samuel's hands shook as he read the entries, each one more disturbing than the last. Edgar Blackwood had been a wealthy landowner in the early 1800s. Obsessed with the occult, he had conducted dark rituals in the cemetery, believing that he could summon spirits to do his bidding. But something had gone terribly wrong. Instead of summoning benevolent spirits, Edgar had unleashed a malevolent force that demanded blood and death. The journal detailed Edgar's descent into madness as the entity he had summoned began to haunt him. Desperate to appease the entity, Edgar had started sacrificing townspeople, burying their bodies in the cemetery. The murders continued until Edgar himself was found dead, his body mutilated and left in the very mausoleum Samuel now stood in. As Samuel finished reading the journal, he heard a faint whisper behind him. He turned, his flashlight flickering, but saw nothing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and Samuel realized it was chanting in an ancient, unknown language. The temperature dropped, and the air became thick with the scent of decay. Panic set in as Samuel tried to leave the mausoleum, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The whispers grew into a cacophony, filling his mind with images of blood and death. Samuel stumbled, dropping the flashlight which rolled away, plunging him into darkness. In the pitch black, Samuel felt something cold and clammy brush against his skin. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He could feel the entity closing in, its malevolent presence suffocating him. Desperate, Samuel tried to remember the rituals mentioned in Edgar's journal, hoping to banish the entity. But it was too late. The entity had claimed countless victims over the years, and Samuel was just another in a long line of sacrifices. His screams echoed through the mausoleum as the entity enveloped him, his body writhing in agony. And then, silence. The next morning, the townspeople found Samuel's lifeless body lying in front of the mausoleum, his face twisted in terror. The journal was clutched in his hands, its pages stained with blood. The curse of Blackwood Cemetery had claimed another victim. News of Samuel's death spread quickly, and the townspeople were more convinced than ever that the cemetery was cursed. They avoided it at all costs, and Blackwood was left to the spirits and the darkness. But the entity remained, waiting for its next victim. Years passed, and Blackwood Cemetery fell into further disrepair. Nature began to reclaim the land, and the cemetery was forgotten by all but the most foolhardy thrill-seekers. But those who dared to venture into Blackwood after dark often met with the same fate as Samuel Gray. The legend of the curse lived on, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain fell in heavy sheets, the whispers of the past could still be heard, echoing through the haunted grounds of Blackwood Cemetery.